Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 1986 anthology horror film Deadtime Stories. Now, I have Deadtime Stories on this DVD set right here called Chilling Classics, which is one of those 50 movie packs that feature 50 different horror movies. And I actually have several box sets very similar to this. Now, these 50 movie packs are supposed to feature public domain movies. However, this movie, Deadtime Stories, is no longer in the public domain. Now, I'll admit, I actually don't know exactly what happened. I don't know if the movie was in the public domain, but then it somehow fell out of the public domain, or if the makers of this box set made a mistake and put this movie in this box set without realizing that it wasn't in the public domain. But there have been reissues of this box set that no longer have this movie on it. So if you find a copy of this collection, Chilling Classics, you're in all likelihood not going to find this movie on here unless you specifically find an older edition of this collection. Now, just this year, 2017, I believe Shout Factory actually released this movie on DVD and Blu-ray. But once again, I have this movie on this old edition of Chilling Classics. Now, my aunt got me this collection for Christmas when I was 13 years old, so this was the Christmas of 2005. So I want to say I was like 13 when I first saw this movie. Now, I'll admit, not all the movies on this collection are the best. Actually, there are a lot of really bad movies on this collection, but there are also some really good movies on this collection as well, and there are actually quite a few well-known movies on this collection that might actually surprise you or even on a collection like this. This collection features movies like Christmas Evil, Driller Killer, Horror Express, Peter Jackson's Bad Taste, Messiah of Evil, the Roger Corman film A Bucket of Blood, and even Dario Argento's Deep Red is on this box set. So while there are a lot of really obscure movies on this box set, there are also quite a few really well-known movies on here as well, or I should say well-known to fans of horror and cult films. Now, Deadtime Stories is one of my favorite movies. At the same time, I'll fully admit that this is not a particularly good movie. This movie, in my opinion, is simultaneously wonderful and horrible at the same time. And I'm not sure if I really want to call this so bad that it's good, because I genuinely love the movie. At the same time, though, I could totally get somebody hating this movie, and I really do think a lot of my love for this movie probably is just nostalgia, because, as I said before, I'm pretty sure I was 13 when I first saw this movie, so I do have a little bit of nostalgia for this movie, and I personally think it's a wonderful movie. At the same time, though, it's a bad movie too. I love this movie, but I'll fully recognize that this is not a particularly good movie. Now, the plot of Deadtime Stories is it's about this guy named Mike who is babysitting his nephew Brian, and Brian is supposed to be in bed, but he's constantly annoying Mike to tell him stories, and also you realize that Brian thinks that the boogeyman is trying to get him, so he thinks his uncle telling him stories would somehow keep the boogeyman away. So in the movie, Uncle Mike tells Brian these 3 stories, but every time he tells him a story, he's like, okay, now go to bed, and every time he leaves the room, Brian is just being an annoying little shit going, Uncle Mike, there's a monster in here, so Uncle Mike has to constantly come back and tell him another story. Now, the first story is set in the Middle Ages, and it's about this fisherman named Peter who has no money, so he sells himself into slavery, and he's eventually bought by two evil witches. And it turns out that these witches are trying to resurrect their sister, who was killed by witch hunters years prior to the events of this story, so they make Peter do things that he doesn't want to do, including luring people to them so they can kill these people to use certain body parts of theirs for the ritual to bring their sister back. And that's all I really want to say about this first story in the movie. The second story in this movie is pretty much a fucked up version of Little Red Riding Hood. And this second story is about this teenage girl named Rachel who has to get this medicine for her grandmother, but somehow the drugstore owner fucks up the order and gives her the medicine that was supposed to go to this other guy. This other guy, as it turns out, is actually a werewolf. And the third story that Uncle Mike tells Brian in this movie is pretty much a fucked up version of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Now, the plot of this story is it's about this family of criminals called the Bears. Like, you have Mama Bear, Papa Bear, and Baby Bear, who is the son in the family who is mentally challenged, and Baby Bear ends up falling in love with this girl named Goldie. And it turns out that Goldie is a complete psychopath, and she also has telekinetic powers. So the story is almost like Texas Chainsaw Massacre meets Carrie. So once again, Deadtime Stories, I think, is a fantastic movie. Once again, it's not a particularly good movie, but I personally love the movie. And a lot of my love for this movie, once again, is probably just nostalgia. Like, if I saw this movie for the first time, like, today or something, I probably wouldn't like it as much, but I really enjoy it, and I personally recommend it if you're a fan of cheesy 80s horror films. And I love the freaking wraparound story of this movie, where you have this uncle who is kind of a dick, telling stories to his nephew, who is an annoying little shit, and it's really fun, like, seeing these two characters play off each other. And also, Uncle Mike is kind of a pervert, honestly, because, like, in the Little Red Riding Hood segment of this movie, like, there's a scene where the character of Rachel, who of course is the character that's based on Little Red Riding Hood, there's a scene where she's, like, checking herself out in the mirror, and she's having fantasies of her boyfriend, like, caressing her, and it's like, okay, this is supposed to be a story that this uncle is telling his 8-year-old nephew. That's really not the kind of story you should be telling an 8-year-old kid. Also, the character of Rachel from the Little Red Riding Hood segment of this movie, the character is supposed to be like 17 years old, and Uncle Mike is like a man in his late 30s or early 40s, and he's describing Rachel as being really hot, and he even says right before he starts telling the story to Brian, like, she's this hot, like, 17-year-old high school senior with, like, firm breasts, and it's like, wait a minute, you're a grown-ass man. You shouldn't be thinking of a 17-year-old in that way, even if it is just a character that you're making up. So I just love how each of the stories in this movie are so inappropriate to be telling to an 8-year-old kid, yet this uncle is telling his 8-year-old nephew these stories. Now, of the 3 stories that Uncle Mike tells Brian in this movie, I want to say that the most straightforward of all of them is, honestly, the first story about Peter and the witches. Even though the story is supposed to take place in medieval times, yet the characters in the story do not even remotely talk like it's medieval times. But at the same time, though, it is just supposed to be a story that this guy is telling his nephew. So you could kind of forgive that, but honestly, Peter and the Witches might actually be the most straightforward of the 3 stories in this film. The second story in the movie, Little Red Running Hood, which of course is a horror version of Little Red Riding Hood, this segment of the film is honestly my least favorite of the 3 stories. mainly because I kind of found Rachel to be an annoying protagonist, and even the villain of the story, the werewolf, who is supposed to be sort of a sympathetic villain, like kind of like a Lawrence Talbot kind of werewolf, he honestly kind of digs his own grave in this story. Like, I could think of a million different ways of him kind of getting out of the situation that he ends up in this story. Like, he didn't have to end up harassing that grandmother the way he did. Like, he could have found another way to get his medicine back, but I don't know, this one is definitely my least favorite of the three stories, but it's still entertaining. And the final segment of this movie, which is the fucked up version of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, is honestly my favorite of the three stories. This one is just batshit insane, because this one doesn't even remotely take itself seriously at all. Like, in the story, you have the police force going after the Bear family and Goldilocks, and they're like the most incompetent police force on the planet. It's just freaking hilarious, and one of the officers who is looking for them, I shit you not, is called Jack Me Nimble. Like, this one is definitely not taking itself seriously at all, and because of that, I think it's the most fun of the three stories. But yeah, Deadtime Stories is a fantastic anthology horror comedy, but don't be expecting, like, a good anthology film like Creepshow or Creepshow 2. This is nowhere near as good as anthology films like that, but it is a fun, cheesy little movie, and I definitely recommend it. But yeah, that was my review on Deadtime Stories, and bye.